Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, continuing our series as we reflect upon what's happened in Afghanistan and Iraq in the entire war on terror. Today, we're going to discuss a report that has come out of the Costs of War project, I should say, of Brown University in the United States, where it's discussed that around, or just nearly 1 million people, in fact, globally have been killed during this war on terror that began around 2 decades ago, and that this war has so far cost around $8 trillion. Now, of course, we've discussed the human aspect of this and the financial aspect of this in the past as well, but it's really good to have this in one place in one report because it really also puts it into context of what those countries that have faced this war on terror have faced, as well as the people of those countries, and also really the American economy, because $8 trillion is not a small sum to have spent during this time. Of course, not all of it, I would think, was spent by the Americans, but nevertheless, that money, one could imagine, would have been better spent in the country as well. There is certainly a debate about whether or not this was worth it, and all those questions I will put now to our esteemed panelists who are joining us from across the United States. We're joined by Dr. Alex Lubin, who is a professor at the Department of African American Studies at Pennsylvania State University. He's also the author of Never Ending War on Terror. He's joining us this morning from State College, Pennsylvania. Joining us from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is Dr. Catherine Lutz, who is a professor emerita of international studies and anthropology at Brown University. She, in fact, leads the Costs of War project, which is a project on the human, social, and financial costs of the Iraq and Afghan wars. And finally, joining us from Columbus, Ohio, is Dr. John Mueller, who is an adjunct professor of political science at Ohio State University. He's also a senior research scientist with the Mershon Center for International Security Studies and is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute as well. John, Catherine, and Alex, good morning to all three of you, and thank you for joining us. Catherine, I'd like to start with you. It was your organization's project that put out this report. How important, and I know that the organization has been working at this for a while and has released reports in the past too, so it's not the first report, but how important was it to have these statistics all in one place?
Well, 10 years ago when we started to collect this information, we knew that there was a need for a comprehensive view of the war. There were lots of reports in the U.S. media on the U.S. soldiers and how they were faring and their losses, but there wasn't really much attention to the civilian world in Iraq and Afghanistan and to the overall cost to the U.S. budget. And so there were a number of experts that we brought together to try and provide this comprehensive picture.
And so when we're looking at these statistics, you know, $8 trillion and nearly 1 million dead, how do you reflect on that?
I view it as a tragedy. It's an extreme expense of dollars, but perhaps most importantly, it's an extreme expense of human lives. And the remarkable work that the Costs of War project has done is not only about the military expenditures, around $8 trillion, but also, and not only the deaths of 1 million, but also the massive displacement of peoples and population who've been forced into migration as a result of their countries being destabilized by this war. So obviously it's hard to put a human cost on war. I expect it goes even deeper than the number of deaths.
You know, John, all of this begun certainly after the 9/11 attacks, which were horrific attacks. But then, was this the correct way to have responded to those attacks?
No, not at all. Neither war was necessary. It was from the get-go a massive, 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 massive exaggeration of the threat that terrorism presented. Al-Qaeda has done very little before or particularly after 9/11. What seems to be the suggestion is that they're very similar to Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin of John Kennedy, a fundamentally trivial entity that got horribly lucky once. The massive exaggeration, which is suggested in these numbers, some numbers are even higher, some are a little bit lower, but nonetheless, the basic pattern is very, very clear, it seems to me. Has not been worth it, and has already been suggested, a real tragedy and absurdity and stupidity.
All right, so Catherine, from the numbers that your project and that you have gathered and your team have gathered, what is it that you're hoping will happen going forward? Is it that we're hoping that there will be, the establishment will revisit its such policy, and is that already happening? Because Biden sort of, alluded to that, right, in his latest speech when it came to reacting after the U.S. finally withdrew from Afghanistan, so to speak, that the U.S. was going to be less militarily involved overseas.
Well, I think a lot of things have to happen that need to go far beyond what President Biden was talking about. I mean, he's said that we will not engage in nation building anymore, but that was never the main project or goal of these wars overseas. The United States still is engaged in an endless war in many other places. Our counter-terror operations are ongoing, whether it's training local forces or actually combat on the ground. We're doing this in over 80 countries. So those wars he did not address. He did not address the Pentagon budget, which just passed the House Armed Services Committee at unprecedented levels. And so I think there's really a need to question much more deeply the American way of war, the American foreign policy being so dependent on our military as opposed to on our other kinds of resources and abilities. So I do think that there's a much more fundamental reckoning that's necessary. The war is not over. Even if the war in Afghanistan is being declared over, we obviously know that the consequences of these wars are going to continue to reverberate and cause harm far into the future.
Alex, I wonder what your thoughts are about why this hasn't created more waves. I mean, I know it's been covered by significant amounts of media, even in the United States, these statistics as well as other such statistics in the past. But I mean, there should be uproar, at least in my opinion, there should be uproar on the part of Americans themselves, because this is all being done technically in their name.
That's right. And it strikes me that we're having this conversation at a time when parts of the United States are underwater because of a weakening infrastructure. And politically within the United States, there are debates now about whether we can afford to spend trillions of dollars to repair crumbling infrastructure. But at the same time, there is no debate publicly, at least among politicians, about the costs of this war. And as Dr. Lutz just said, this is a war that was not formally declared. The authorization for use of military force continues. The withdrawal from Afghanistan does not mean an end to the war, as it just means, it seems, a deployment of a different kind of counterterrorism action that will rely more on drone and remote controlled warfare rather than the proverbial troops or boots on the ground. So yes, I do think there needs to be a reckoning about what the war on terror is. Part of that reckoning will have to deal with the fear that constantly gets manufactured about the threat of terrorism, the fear of let's be frank, of Muslims in the United States, the kind of Islamophobia that drives us to endure in a war that has very little geopolitical benefits to us, and that costs Americans a tremendous amount of resources.
Yeah, and John, I'm glad Alex brought up that issue of essentially homeland security, right? The entire goal of this was to ensure that the United States remains safe. Has it achieved that?
Well, the United States was never unsafe, and the extrapolation from 9/11 was absurd. No terrorist act in history before or after 9/11 has visited even 1/10 as much total destruction as 9/11. In other words, it's an extreme outlier. Meanwhile, the FBI has followed up something like between 10 and 20 million tips in the United States to find Muslim extremists and come up with just a handful of people by comparison. And the total number of people killed by terrorists, Islamist terrorists, since 9/11 has been about 5 or 6 per year. Nonetheless, the hysteria remains high. And I think what's going back to what Dr. Lutz said, I think what's happening is there's, in general, and speaking, people don't spend that much time thinking about foreign lives, but only about American lives. And both in the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the number of American dead is really quite small, even though it ended up being twice as many as died on 9/11. And when the news report comes out, it tells you how many Americans were killed in the last month, someplace or other, but never how many other people were killed. And that's basically the similar during the Vietnam War, during the Korean War. There seems to have been very little concern about Vietnamese deaths, whether on the North or in the South, and the same with Korea. So I think that's being the case. In terms of the Homeland Security spending, they've done a lot of work with that, as you suggest. And the amount of money being spent is vastly disproportionate to the threat, no matter how you look at it, that is presented by terrorism. Just to give you one snapshot, in order for the increased expenditures on Homeland Security to be justified, they would have had to deter or to disrupt three 9/11s every 4 years, almost one every year. Or basically 300 attacks like the one on London in 2005, almost one a day. In other words, they've been absurdly, by any reasonable standard, and when I'm using standard is basically standard cost benefit and risk analytic procedures, the spending has been massively disproportionate to the degree to which there is a threat.
Yeah. Catherine, I wanted to put a two-pronged question to you. So firstly, on this issue of foreign lives mattering, I'm glad John brought that up, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that and how much of a challenge that is, right, to make Americans realize that, and I'm not saying Americans don't, prioritize, I don't want to generalize, every American does not prioritize foreign lives, but for many of them, possibly this is out of sight and out of mind. And then secondly, is there a danger of that getting even worse, considering we've discussed drone warfare, right? And drone warfare has been happening throughout these years as well, especially recently, but that will, I would think, pick up even more, and that's even more out of sight and out of mind because there aren't service members really at risk in that case.
Yes, when we started the project 10 years ago, we put out these numbers, the bodies and the dollars, and the American media tended very much to prefer to report on or to focus on the dollars. I think that is that's something that politically, at least when you want to move the American public, that seems to be one of the important levers, is to have them understand that this is costing them, or at least their next generation of their families, because this is a credit card war, it's costing them dollars. But the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, has really been very important in helping educate white Americans about the disparity in the way in which lives are valued by race. And so I think that has been coming home to people in a way that it hadn't before. And I think this will really help us to, again, come to a much more, a less selective empathy when it comes to the lives lost in war.
Yeah, Alex, I'm glad Catherine brought up Black Lives Matter, because I read research recently about two aspects, and these are internal aspects of the United States. One is the militarization of police within the country, and secondly, the Black Lives Matter movement as well. And there was an argument made in that research paper that this will and should, in fact, help better policymaking when it comes to foreign policy decisions on the part of the White House, hopefully down the road. Do you agree with that? Do you think that those sorts of internal dynamics also then will down the road make for better foreign policies?
Well, one would hope, but I don't have much optimism that that's actually the case. I think the link that seems to be more powerful is that counterinsurgency policing and the militarization of U.S. domestic police forces is increasingly making or allowing state and city governments to police civil rights organizations like Black Lives Matter as though they were just another insurgency that have to be contained. So while there may be greater empathy for non-US lives in the kinds of global solidarities that the Black Lives Matter movement has been articulating. At the same time, there's also the globalization of the war on terror as it comes back to the United States in the form of military hardware and counterinsurgency policing that increasingly has treated certain Black political activists as though they were terrorists that had to be contained.
What do you think about internal domestic dynamics then, John, and the kind of effect that they may have? We also have a U.S. population which is ever more diverse.
Yes, I'm not sure if it's going to make all that much difference, but I think what's happening is we're now moving into what might be called an Iraq syndrome period, or Iraq-Afghanistan syndrome period, very similar to the one after Vietnam. And when Vietnam collapsed with a similar kind of a disaster and chaos and embarrassment as what's happening with Afghanistan, the decision basically was, let's not do that again. That did not mean giving up on the Cold War against the Soviet Union and China, but it meant not using military force and invasion to actually carry it out. And for 25 years, to the end of the century, there were no more Vietnams. There was, helping the Afghans against the Soviet invaders, and there was an invasion of the world's tiniest place, namely Grenada, because it turned communist. But real invasions of any sort resembling Vietnam were not done. I think that got changed then by 9/11, the shock of it. And that basically allowed them to consider the possibility, and actually do, obviously, actual invasions of countries, even ones that had nothing to do, essentially, with 9/11, the Taliban in Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The disastrous results of both of those wars, which we've, of course, been talking about, has led, I think, now to this Iraq syndrome. In which the basic thing is, okay, we'll continue the war on terrorism, we'll continue to worry about it, and some of the things that Dr. Lutz talked about will continue, drone flights and stuff like that. But the idea of actually invading a country to make it whole, make it the way we want it to be, will not be carried out anymore. In other words, no longer to be a question of no more Vietnams, but no more Iraqs. That's been seen both in the military and in public opinion. In the case of the military, as early as 2012, a prominent statement out of the Pentagon said, in italics, so you couldn't miss it, we will not continue to prepare for long-term stability operations. In other words, we don't know how to do it, which would certainly be an understatement. The other situation was in 2013 when Obama was going to bomb Syria. And he got bipartisan support for doing this after there was a gas attack at that time. But he wanted Congress to be on board. Well, Congress was on board for a while until it was over the summer, and the Congress people went back to their districts and found that the United States, American people, were on both sides of the aisle, were extraordinarily opposed to doing anything like that again, because it might lead to another Iraq or another Afghanistan, particularly another Iraq. And so Obama backed away from his red line thing about bombing Syria. So I think public opinion has been moving in that direction quite some time.
I wonder if there's, or how important, let me put it this way, what's called the military-industrial complex is in this regard, right? There's a lot of money that is made through these, and has been made through these wars, right? So we've had private contractors, certainly, and we've had a lot of the arms manufacturers making, a lot of money. And so I would think that continues to guide, or will continue to guide at some level, policymaking in these regards?
Absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up, because one of the things that, when I talk about the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement on public opinion, that public opinion is relatively toothless as long as the military-industrial complex, the Pentagon, and Congress all continue to see this kind of massive investment in military power as the primary project of American government. It takes the great majority of our federal budget at this point, the discretionary budget. What's been called the carry-on imperative is really very alive and well, which is to say, we have been doing things this way forever. We're going to continue to do them this way, whether we tweak our foreign policy one way or the other in terms of intervention, or just standing from a distance and throwing some drone strikes and other things at what we perceive as the problem. I think that unless America returns to a democratic system in which war is declared by Congress and Congress reflects the will of the people, and we have transparency around the costs in lives and dollars, we're going to continue to have this kind of massive profit-seeking and profit-taking from war. And those powerful actors who have the ear of Congress have been able, just again yesterday, to continue to get massive contracts into that National Defense Authorization Act, have been able to ensure that the AUMF does not get rescinded, which is the open-ended charter for war. We're going to continue to have 800 military bases around the world, draining resources and in many cases, like in the case of Guam, contaminating the water supply, contaminating the soil with our quite toxic military operations, our jet fuel and so on. So I think there's really a massive restructuring and rethinking that has to happen, not just a tweak.
Alex, this is really challenging, isn't it? Because with the amount of people who are getting rich and have gotten rich over this entire process, it's really hard to put that back into the box, right? I mean, how does one control that situation when we're talking about, money being made? And, within capitalist society, the argument is, listen, we're just meeting the demand. So how do we make, I don't know, I mean, I think it might sound cliche to put it this way, but how do we make peace more profitable than war?
I mean, it's a great question, and if I had the answer to that, I would be an extremely powerful person. I think what you are putting your finger on is that the military-industrial complex is not only the wedding of the military industry with the Department of Defense, but also with public policy. And one of the things that we know about the spending under the war on terror is that a large percentage of it, I've seen ranges from anywhere from 60% all the way up to 80%, returned to the U.S. in the coffers of U.S. weapons manufacturing companies. What that means is that fighting wars is one of the ways that the United States has been able to provide jobs in an economy that is increasingly deindustrializing. So as our industrial base is declining, weapons manufacturing becomes one hope for a good paying job for many Americans in many American cities. And so until we can break that economic incentive for warfare, it does seem unlikely that peace and peacemaking will ever become more economically feasible. I mean, obviously, as Catherine Lutz just said, democratizing how we go to war, recognizing the War Powers Act that was enacted after the Vietnam War, discarding the fear-mongering that makes it impossible to critique the war on terror sometimes. These are all important factors.
We just have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to give both John and Catherine time for just final comments. John, if you can, just under a minute, what is there light at the end of the tunnel, in your opinion, in any regard? I mean, where can we look for hope for better foreign policy making in this regard?
An exhaustion with war. And I must say I disagree with some of the comments earlier, though I would agree with most of them. I think it's been mostly bottom up. During the Cold War, the American people bought the idea that there were communists under the bed every place, and the politicians were terrified to go against it. Needless to say, the military-industrial complex benefited from that, but it didn't cause it. Eisenhower, in fact, thought that the Russians were never in a million years going to attack Western Europe, but he was never willing to say that in public. I deal with this a lot in my book, a recent book called The Stupidity of War. And during the war on terror, the same thing. People are terrified. Obama actually wanted to say the kind of things I think should be said. Your chance of being killed by a terrorist is less than being killed by a drowning in the bathtub. He looked at it, and his staff said, no, you can't say that because you'll be ridiculing the fears of the American people. So he didn't say it. So the manipulation is not top down, but from the bottom up. And there are plenty of people, of course, really willing and able to jump on that. So it's not clear that, and now we've got abject failure for 20 years by the American military in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Stupefying failure. And what we don't get is any kind of people saying maybe our military isn't all that great. Instead, they stay very high on the pedestal, and that's why they keep getting the money. All you have to do is say we have to keep our boys and girls from out there killing other people, and people say, yeah, that's what they're there for. They're saving our freedoms, and no one thinks further than that.
And then, Catherine, just as final thoughts on that, that is a huge challenge, isn't it? Nationalism/patriotism in this regard. It's really hard to get over that national pride and hopefully, reform the system.
Yes, but I guess I really feel that the American public is following a lot of the political and media rhetoric that suggests that they should be afraid, that suggests that the U.S. military is protecting them no matter what kind of consequences, no matter what we see in terms of the outcome of Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think that changing the rhetoric of the powerful is really important, that the people, again, public opinion polls show that if people know what the military budget is, they want a smaller budget. They want more money invested. They want us not to have an arms industry that is the main job creator. And we know actually from our Dr. Heidi Peltier of our project has a study that shows that the number of jobs created by non-military spending is much higher per dollar spent than military spending. So we have other opportunities to educate the public and hope that the leaders will follow.
We'll have to leave it there at that, but we really appreciate Catherine, Alex, and John for taking their time out this morning to share their expertise with us. We were discussing there, and I want to remind viewers of these statistics because they're really important. So nearly 1 million people killed, each of those individual lives important, right? And we've discussed that in this regard as well. The $8 trillion, certainly, yes, is also a shocking number, but it's lives, how sacred human lives are that should really matter to all of us, be us American or not. That should be our guiding principles should be to save human lives, innocent human lives, right? And that hasn't been done in this process. Homeland security has not improved, or at least that goal has not been met. In fact, it can be argued that a lot more radicalization possibly has happened because of the loss of innocent lives, and that certainly can be debated as well. We got through quite a bit there, but I think we were able to really contextualize through our esteemed panelists what these sort of statistics mean and what we're hoping then will happen in the near future, hopefully, when it comes to the change in American foreign policy. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, there's been an interesting survey conducted by Foreign Affairs, and it's been a survey of experts, and they've gotten their opinions on the two-state solution versus the one-state solution when it comes to the issue of Israel-Palestine. We've discussed this quite a few times on this show, so this is not a new topic, certainly, but what is interesting is the way that differing experts, depending on which side they stand on, reacted, right? So the conviction that the two-state solution is still viable was held mainly by those who are pro-Israel advocates, responding to Foreign Affairs, that is, in their question. But Palestinian and Arab experts, and who we could call realists, doubted that a Palestinian state can really ever emerge in the current conditions, at least. And that's something that's been reflected many, many times by many experts we've spoken to on this show, that really it is just a one-state solution that can reasonably solve the situation in a just fashion. So let's discuss that a bit further. I'm joined by Zaha Hassan, who is a human rights lawyer. She's also a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's joining us this morning from McLean, Virginia. Zaha, good morning, and thank you for joining us. How do you react to this? Because, it's been argued many times on my show, too, that two states are simply not even possible if you just look at what's happening on the ground.
I think that's right. I think it's very difficult to see how a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine, I will put conflict in quotation marks, has currently evolved. And I think what you saw in that Foreign Affairs survey of experts wasn't necessarily the pro-Israel community of analysts saying that a two-state solution was still viable. They were saying that we can't let it go. We can't let the two-state solution go, because to let the two-state solution go would mean that Israel is no longer it's no longer possible for Israel to be a democratic and Jewish state, and they're not willing to conceive of the possibility of a binational state, or a state in which it represents the interests of all of its population, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, whether Jewish, Palestinian, or otherwise. And so what you're seeing is a real reluctance by folks in the policy space that have historically been very, been apologetic in some respects to the state of Israel, a real reluctance to let go of the idea of a two-state solution, but recognizing that it is looking more and more unlikely, if not that door has already closed completely.
So I'm thank you for your clarification there. You're completely right, Zaha. That wasn't necessarily just pro-Israel in the way that I described it. But I wonder, why then desperately hold on to that vision of two states? The argument on that side is that, listen, we need to preserve a Jewish state. What is the fear of a one state? Would it be that they would be losing then that identity? How does one then overcome that?
It would be definitely a demise of a two-state solution, or the idea of a two-state solution would be a demise of the very premise of Zionism, which is the ingathering of Jewish people around the world to a territory in which they were the predominant ethnic religious group, and to organize and govern according to Jewish interests, to the exclusion of the other indigenous people on the land. And so if we say that the two-state solution is no longer viable, then you have to think about what kind of system of governance would replace it. And there's only two alternatives. There's the current alternative, which is an apartheid reality in which Jewish Israelis enjoy rights and protections under law, and where non-Jewish communities, particularly the Palestinian indigenous community of the area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, have lesser rights or no rights at all. And you see this with respect to the Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, and in Gaza in particular, under blockade as well. And you see it with respect to Israel's treatment of the indigenous Palestinians in what is present-day Israel. They don't enjoy equal rights and privileges, though they hold Israeli citizenship. So the idea that the two-state solution is no longer viable would mean that either you have this apartheid reality continue and be legitimated, or you allow for Israel to be a state for all of its citizens, regardless of their ethno-religious identity. And that would be the demise of Zionism. But it would be more consistent with democratic and liberal values, things that Israel, in its Declaration of Independence, held dear, and things which the international community, and in particular the United States, values as well. So there's a contradiction here. If U.S. policy continues to support Israel unconditionally and turns a blind eye to Israel's human rights abuses and its treatment of Palestinians living under its control and jurisdiction, then the U.S. can't credibly support the international rules-based order and international law in any other context. You can't carve out an Israel exception and then maintain credibility in other political contexts and with respect to U.S. policy in other conflict zones.
I wonder if we can go back for a moment to the two-state solution as it's been presented, right? So for me, even objectively speaking, if I'm completely removing my biases in this situation, it doesn't sound like a very good deal for Palestinians at all, because there's always talk about a state for Palestinians which would not have military powers, so it for all intents and purposes, cannot then defend itself, really, which every state around the world has the right to defend themselves if they're attacked. And then secondly, the way that Donald Trump, at least in his plan, I'm not saying that was always the plan that the two states were based on, but even that plan, I mean, it was, when you look at the map, as I'm sure you did, that was presented by Kushner, it really didn't give much to the Palestinians. So I wonder, why even do this then? I mean, are we expecting, or are they expecting the Palestinians to just, blindly accept this? And why would they? I'm really confused about that situation.
I mean, what you put your finger on, Waqar, is something very important. And it's the fact that there was never, from the very beginning of the Oslo peace process, there was never a meeting of the minds on exactly what the objective was of Israel-Palestine negotiations. There was this idea that there was this interim agreement that would create political space for Israelis and Palestinians and Israelis to negotiate towards a comprehensive solution, but there was no agreement on what the objective was, on what that solution was going to be. The Israelis always hid the ball. You will not see in any of the agreements signed between Israelis and Palestinians an Israeli commitment to the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state. That was never articulated by the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, they entered negotiations with this blind faith that Israel was negotiating in good faith and that they would see an end to the Israeli occupation that would allow for the creation of Palestinian state. So over the last decades, what you've seen then is an Israeli government trying to prolong negotiations for as long as it could so that it could create facts on the ground that would forestall a two-state solution. And you saw a U.S. government that was so intent on maintaining negotiations, it was willing to forego the enforcement of international law and really putting or using its leverage with Israel to stem settlement construction in order to encourage Israel to stay at the negotiating table or to continue sort of this charade of negotiations. And so now we're at the point now where we've gone from a couple of 100,000 settlers at the start of the Oslo peace process to now almost 700,000 settlers in the occupied West Bank, and a blockade over Gaza to completely disconnect it from any political solution at all. It's highly unlikely, if one is being honest and looking at the facts as you have articulated them, to see how you're going to get an Israeli government that has been emboldened over the years towards not actually coming to a political solution, to getting to one that is, in fact, supportive of international law, because for so long, international law has not played a part in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. And the problem today with the Palestinian Authority is that it, too, has become so invested in a peace process, and its entire credibility has become sewn into the peace process, that it is not able to see beyond continuing negotiations. So that's the unfortunate place
Zaha,
that we're at.
I'm going to cut in.
Now.
I apologize for interrupting you. We're quickly running out of time, so I just wanted to, before I let you go, I wanted to get your thoughts on something that you've already mentioned, but I wanted to expand that to include the Abraham Accords, right? So does this mean that there will be even less pressure on Israel even now from those specific countries that have come to those deals and normalization of ties with Israel, and then that just means that Israel has even a freer hand, more carte blanche? We have about a minute and a half left. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the Abraham Accords have had not had anything to do with Israel-Palestine peace. They've had everything to do with the interests of the particular countries involved in normalizing. And if you just look at the United Arab Emirates and the follow-on agreements that it's had with Israel since the Abraham Accords were signed, what you see is efforts to blur distinctions between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Those agreements, some of those follow-on agreements have included agreements with settler companies and with and have involved delegations of settlers traveling to the UAE to talk about expanding relationships in the tourism sector, for example. And, just recently we've seen that the UAE concluded an energy deal with Israel for a gas field offshore from Gaza.
Indeed.
So, those relations will continue. I think it'll be a lot more difficult moving forward as Israel continues to solidify its control and its settlement interests inside East Jerusalem for any kind of relations and business deals to be conducted in East Jerusalem. I think that will be a step too far for many.
Well, Zaha, we'll leave it there at that, but we really appreciate you taking our time out of a busy schedule to speak to us this morning and for sharing your expertise with us and your insight. We were discussing there with Zaha Hassan, who was discussing Israel-Palestine and the possibility of a one-state solution versus two-state solution. Increasingly we have people arguing that it's really just a one-state solution which is viable and practical, considering the realities on the ground. And those realities have been in place for a while, but they're only getting ever more ingrained. And so the reality of a two-state solution, or the dream of a two-state solution, as we may put to, is less and less practical and seems more and more something that is fantasy or even worse, right, in many regards. What will happen? Will those countries that have signed the Abraham Accords, as I mentioned right towards the end, and as Zaha correctly pointed out, they don't have now any incentive to push Israel, certainly, right? And possibly they've never done it, but at least now it's out in the open. And then where does this leave the Palestinians, right? Where does this leave any just solution for them, which seems to be the core issue and remains the core issue, certainly in this regard. That's something certainly we're going to keep a very close eye on here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.